When we speak of cultural contacts, we must remember that unlike today, in the past, culture seldom traveled from one place to another. Today we have cultural interchange programs where people of one region go to another region and communicate their culture. In the past, this did not exist. The question, however, arises, how do we find Indian influence in places like Burma, Rome, China, and even Japan? For example, in Malaysia, temple architecture and postures of the image of the Buddha are similar to those that we see in India. In Rome, the peacock did not exist. The peacock is an Indian bird. But in a particular Roman tomb, we have discovered two peacocks. Where did the Romans get the idea of a peacock? There must have been some cultural exchange between Rome and India. And the answer perhaps lies in economics, trade to be more precise. And to explore this topic further, we have with us here Professor Taupati Sengupta and Professor Srila Roy. Ma'am Sengupta, what do we exactly understand by the region Central Asia?
Yes, Central Asia was a very important region which played an important role in this cultural exchange and cultural contact between India and Rome. But it is very difficult and perhaps not right to define any physical region in watertight compartments. So also is the case with Central Asia, but we can roughly define it as a land which lies to the west of the two valleys of Wang Ho and Yangtze Kiang in the east, and in the north the plateau of Siberia, to the west the Ural River and the Caspian Mountains, and in the south our own Himalayas.
So what led to the emergence of cultural contacts between India and Central Asia in the ancient period?
First of all, actually Central Asia was not really unknown to the Indians, and it will be very wrong to think that the Himalayas had acted as a great barrier between Central Asia and India. The region of Afghanistan takes a special place of importance in any discussion in contact between India and Central Asia. Afghanistan commanded the mountain passes, the Hindu Kush, the Khyber, the Bolan and the Gomal. Out of this, the Gomal and Bolan was more important, so also was Hindu Kush. Actually, these passes were so open, sometimes it appeared that there was no barrier, and people would move, caravans would move, missionaries would move, traders would move almost without any hindrance. And there were settlements on both the sides of these passes, which indicates that they need to be guarded because they were so important in human movements. And if we go back to the days of the Indus culture, we find that traders from Indus, even they traveled beyond Afghanistan in search of raw material sometimes, or sometimes to sell their finished product. This contact became much more important, much more significant when we find that hordes of Central Asian people are coming and settling down in India in search of new homes, and this is known as the Aryan migration into India.
When we speak of cultural contacts, we must remember that unlike today, in the past, culture seldom traveled from one place to another. Today we have cultural interchange programs where people of one region go to another region and communicate their culture. In the past, this did not exist. The question, however, arises, how do we find Indian influence in places like Burma, Rome, China, and even Japan? For example, in Malaysia, temple architecture and postures of the image of the Buddha are similar to those that we see in India. In Rome, the peacock did not exist. The peacock is an Indian bird. But in a particular Roman tomb, we have discovered two peacocks. Where did the Romans get the idea of a peacock? There must have been some cultural exchange between Rome and India. And the answer perhaps lies in economics, trade to be more precise. And to explore this topic further, we have with us here Professor Taupati Sengupta and Professor Srila Roy. Ma'am Sengupta, what do we exactly understand by the region Central Asia?
Yes, Central Asia was a very important region which played an important role in this cultural exchange and cultural contact between India and Rome. But it is very difficult and perhaps not right to define any physical region in watertight compartments. So also is the case with Central Asia, but we can roughly define it as a land which lies to the west of the two valleys of Wangho and Yangtze Kiang in the east, and in the north the plateau of Siberia, to the west the Ural River and the Caspian Mountains, and in the south our own Himalayas.
And so what led to the emergence of cultural contacts between India and Central Asia in the ancient period?
First of all, actually Central Asia was not really unknown to the Indians, and it will be very wrong to think that the Himalayas had acted as a great barrier between Central Asia and India. The region of Afghanistan takes a special place of importance in any discussion between contact between India and Central Asia. Afghanistan commanded the mountain passes, the Hindu Kush, the Khyber, the Bolan, and the Gomal. Out of this, the Gomal and Bolan was more important. So was also Hindu Kush. Actually, these passes were so open, sometimes it appeared that there was no barrier, and people would move, caravans would move, missionaries would move, traders would move almost without any hindrance. And there were settlements on both the sides of these passes, which indicates that they need to be guarded because they were so important in human movements. And if we go back to the days of the Indus culture, we find that traders from Indus, even they traveled beyond Afghanistan in search of raw material sometimes, or sometimes to sell their finished product. This contact became much more important, much more significant when we find that hordes of Central Asian people are coming and settling down in India in search of new homes, and this is known as the Aryan migration into India. More or less on the basis of archaeological excavations, archaeological finds, we can say that it was from the Russian central steppes of the Central Asian regions that the Aryans came into India, and after that we find enemies, invaders never stopped coming into India from the Central Asian direction till almost the 18th century. So contact with Central Asia had been very old, very ancient, and this contact found a new dimension when we find that another group of Central Asian people coming down to India. Well, these great migrations from Central Asia in India did not really present any political crisis, but this was going to be of immense importance so far as trade was concerned, culture was concerned, and the opening up of India to West Asia and Central Asia was concerned. And we find the new invaders that came were the Bactrians, the Parthians, the Shakas and the Kushans. The Bactrians opened up the Mediterranean region, West Asia and the Mediterranean for the Indians. The Shakas and the Kushans would open up Central Asia for the Aryans.
We must clarify here another question that would come up, I think, Professor Sengupta, when you spoke about the Kushanas. I think the post-Kushana period has been designated as a dark age in Indian history. And this is what I take exception to. Yeah. Would you believe that the post-Kushana period was really a dark age?
Actually, it is not only the post-Kushana period. It is considered that after the fall of the Mauryas and the emergence of the Guptas, there emerged a period which was somewhat like the Dark Age. In the first place, theoretically, the concept of Dark Age, the concept of the Golden Age are given up concepts in history. And this was considered as a Dark Age because our knowledge was comparatively very scanty regarding this period, but as a result of various archaeological excavations, as a result of many conferences in the Central Asian history, and as a result of the tremendous find of the numismatic materials from this region, we have unfolded a very rich period of Indian history, and it would be very much wrong to term it as the Dark Age of Indian history. Efflorescence that we find in the Gupta period, this was the sort of a beginning for the great role that the Guptas played in history.
Exactly.
So it signaled the arrival of the Guptas into Indian
No, it
politics.
was, I wouldn't say that it signaled the arrival of the Guptas, but the Guptas took up the strands which were left behind by the Kushans and the Shakas, and they added their own Indian touches to that, and what emerged was one of the greatest period in the cultural history of India, if not of the world.
Trade had reached new heights during the Gupta period, even though it has been said that trade was declining, but we do have some examples of very rich trade relations, and different routes were established within the country. The Gupta period fostered both internal and external trade, and we find that trade routes in India were linked with Central Asia ever since the time of the political control of the Shakas and the Kushanas. So it was really nothing new that occurred during the Gupta period. Now these routes mainly followed highways and riverways or waterways, but waterways were more popular for bulk trade. Now, among the chief waterways that ran from Tamrolipti, which corresponds to present-day Tomluk, and Haldia, which is about 80 kilometers from Calcutta, south of Calcutta, to the old city of Champa, corresponds to Bhagalpur in Bihar, and from there it proceeded to Pataliputra. From Pataliputra, as you know, is modern Patna, and from Pataliputra it proceeded to Varanasi and to Kausambi corresponding to Allahabad, and from there one branch went to the port of Bhrigukacha or the port of Broch, right on the western coast, and Bhrigukacha was the largest entry point on the western coast. So Bhrigukacha on the mouth of river Narmada. Now from Kausambi again we find that a trunk road passed along the south bank of river Yamuna to Mathura, and from there a branch crossed to modern Rajasthan and Thar desert to the port of Patala near the mouth of Indus. The main road, however, went to modern Delhi, then to Punjab after crossing the 5 rivers there, to the city of Taxila, from where it continued till Kabul Valley and to Central Asia. So that was the main route that was followed. And how did the travelers travel? They had to travel through forests, very dense forests, and highways often proved to be rather risky, rather hazardous. And so the traders never traveled by themselves, singly, that is what I mean, and they would form into groups, sometimes numbering to more than 500 men, mainly because of safety and security against highway robbery. And another thing that we should also remember is the trade was restricted mainly to dry summer and winter seasons. They could not possibly trade during rainy season, during monsoon, when rivers would be in spate and they would become less navigable. So again, their long journeys would become rather risky. So it was confined to particular seasons like summer and winter. The emergence of the Silk Route was historically a very, very significant event. Now, in the context of the Silk Route, we find that the Taklamakan Desert was encircled with a number of oases. Oases can be seen in desert areas, and these oases played a very important part in the Silk Route itself. And these oases became the staging points on the route, and these oases gradually evolved into trading towns, and in fact one can even find Buddhist stupas and monasteries in many of these oasis trading towns, right? So this is how the oases were gradually becoming economically, culturally and socially also very important. And the Silk Route followed from Luoyang and Chang'an in China, and this route came to Dunhuang, where it bifurcated. The northern route went through Turfan, Karashahar and Kucha or Kucha, and the southern route went through Nia and Khotan. And finally, the northern and the southern routes converged at Kashgar. Now, from Kashgar, it went to the town of Bactria or Balkh, and from there to Iran and the eastern Mediterranean, or southwards to India. So this is what the route was like. Another thing to note about the Silk Route is that it was not a single linear route, right? It had various branches. It would branch off here and there, and it incorporated a number of branches that took off from these oasis towns that I've been talking about. Now, at oasis towns, what would happen? At oasis towns, the caravans would stop, and animals would sometimes be replaced or replenished, and it would be a resting place, and then the movement would start again. The roads were obviously very rough, and the caravans had to traverse through hardy mountainous regions and desert areas, and traveling could also be very, very tough because of severe climatic conditions.
Ma'am, so what was the significance of this Indo-Central Asian trade?
Actually, trade in general, as an action of cross-cultural activity, is very important. And to understand this Indo-Central Asian trade, or we can give it two different names. We can say that it was the Indo-Roman trade, okay, because Central Asia was an intermediary in this trade, which actually began in China and terminated in the Roman Empire, because these traders were purveyors of culture. These traders could break the isolation of the places, and these traders could also create the environment and also fund the suitable persons and institutions for important and significant cultural activity also.
So the traders themselves were not disseminators of culture?
No, we wouldn't say. We can say that they were the catalysts. They were the catalyst. Sometimes some traders were very highly refined cultural people. The leader of the trading group, the Shreshthis, some of the Shreshthis who led the guilds actually in India, and some of them were culturally very, very strong people, culturally very well informed people, but they propagated the culture of India when they went from India, or when they came from Central Asia. The Central Asians, they were also great patrons of culture, and we can see the fluorescence of such cultural activities in the Kushana period, in the expressions of the Gandhara art, or we can say their intellectual activity in the Yavana Jataka, which is a very important treatise on Buddhism, and also very important for knowing about the Central Asian people. This trade had two parts. Of course, overseas trade, overland trade was there, as Mrs. Roy had been telling us about the various routes. But when the monsoon wind was discovered, part of this trade became seaborne. So as a result of this, had a great political implication as well. These would come from Central Asia, then they would take a southerly route and come to the lower Indus Valley. Because you see, the Sassanids in this region, in this region, they were creating a lot of trouble. So the ultimate destiny of these merchandise was not very sure. Whether they were going to reach the Roman Empire, that was not very sure. So all this would come to the lower Indus Valley, or Shentu, as it is known in the Chinese records, known as the Ho Han Shu and the Shi Han Shu, the history of the earlier Han Dynasty and the later Han Dynasty. From these two books, we come to know a lot about this trade and about this region also. So we find the Kushans emerge as the next intermediary, the most important intermediary in this trade. What you have to remember about the Kushans is that the Kushana Empire that we had in India was not an Indian empire. It was an extension of a Central Asian empire. Okay, having a lot of emporia. Mathura was an emporia. Bactria was a very important. Bactria was a capital, and we find that Peshawar was important, Ujjain was important, Pataliputra was absolutely in the outer fringes, Varanasi was important. So we find from all these places merchandise would be taken. They would go to to the lower Indus Valley. From the lower Indus Valley, they would take an overland route, go to Central Asia. And sometimes they would be all accumulated in either Broach or Barbaricum, and from there they would take the boats and taken by a maritime route to the Roman Empire. Sometimes the Western Roman Empire, they would go to the two ports, where the two important places on the Mediterranean would be taken. So part of it was overland, part of it was overseas. So that is very important. Right. And you see that when the Roman import was sort of being cut down, we find that the lower Indus Valley was also losing its importance. But it would be absolutely wrong to think that the lower Indus Valley, the trade was on the decline. This Indo-Roman trade was on the decline. At one time, Pliny had lamented that all the gold of Rome had gone to India. But now you see, with the decline of the Roman Empire, there was some lesser demands for these luxury items, which they imported from the east, from the Orient. But it was not totally lost, because the Shakas were there. The Shakas were there following the Kushanas, because the Kushanas were also having a great deal of trouble in their own Central Asian homes, because in Central Asia we find that there is continuous migration of homeless people. It is known as the Ethnological Museum. So we find that different ethnic groups were trying to find new homes, and as a result of the Arsacid dynasty which came up, the Kushans found a very strong protest there. But the Shakas continued, And it was from these Shakas that Chandragupta too wanted to take away the Gujarat region, the various ports in the rich seaports of Gujarat, so that the Guptas would be in a position to control the Roman trade.
Isn't it also that Chandragupta II, Vikramaditya, was the first Indian king to conquer a region in Central Asia
With
Balhika?
well, it is not exactly Central Asia, we can say it is Balkh, which is in Afghanistan. He was the first Indian king to go to the Trans-Indus region for a conquest.
Right.
Maybe he wanted to take that possession, but we are not really in the exact knowledge of the
No,
what
it is
was
not
the real
right.
truth.
Right.
Whether he had been able to conquer that land, but the campaign itself was significant because he understood the immense commercial potentiality of that area.
What were the chief objects of this trade with Central Asia?
Oh, there were a variety of items that were sent. We can say that different varieties of cotton and silk cloth, silk from Varanasi, cotton from Bengal, those were two very important items. Then there was mask, there was elephant tusk, from which beautiful caskets would be made for keeping the relics of the Buddha. Then there was different kinds of spices made in India, produced in India, spices which were imported from Southeast Asia, that would be sent. Various kinds of incense would be sent. Then there was alway wool, and you'd be surprised to know that teak was also sent for shipbuilding. And of course there was sandalwood, gold and gems from the south. There was yak tail from the mountain, from the hills. Then different kinds of grains, in which there was a variety of rice. Rice was a very, it was a luxury item in Rome. It was a luxury item in many places in Central Asia. The Indian rice with beautiful aroma, that was in great demand. And as for what was brought from there, we can say the most important item and the most expensive item, one of the most expensive item, were the war horses. The war horses were in great demand in India. You can trace it even in the epics also. So the war horses, they had to be paid in gold coins, and they were brought from the steppes of Central Asia, and they would be brought overland. But when there were marauders which were coming up in different parts of Central Asia, they would not send these horses by the land route, they would be sent by the sea route. And now we find the Arabian horses were the main item of trade, but during most of the time of the Gupta period, these horses would come from Central Asia by the land route. And you would be surprised to know that from here these horses would be sent by ship to the very distant destinations in Southeast Asia. And if the horse died, its body had to be thrown into the sea, the mane had to be remained, and half the price would be paid on the arrival of that mane. It shows how greatly horse was valued as an item of trade in this time.
So it was at this time that the horses replaced the elephants in the Indian army then?
Elephants were reduced. Horses were increased. Elephants were reduced. The cavalry was becoming more important.
Horse-based.
The infantry was always very important. The archers were important, but the cavalry was becoming larger because import was increasing. That's why there were many takers. There were many sellers also.
We have come to the end of today's discussion, but the discussion does not end here. We have talked about the background to Indo-Central Asian relations. We have spoken of the various routes undertaken to reach Central Asia. We have also spoken about the significance of trade in the cultural exchange between India and Central Asia.